Imagine being just so terrified of the people moving into your neighborhood that you are actually willing to, like, legally ban your own sacred ancient religious practices.
Right, just to build a legislative wall,
Well,
basically.
exactly, just to keep those new neighbors out. I mean, imagine looking at your own culture, your own traditions, and just deciding to sacrifice them on the altar of sheer political survival.
It's a massive compromise.
It really is. Today, we're looking at a community, and specifically a media figure who is pushed to the absolute brink of political desperation. Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to today's deep dive.
It is a scenario that sounds almost dystopian, honestly, or at least like a really radical thought experiment.
Yeah.
But it is a very real political calculus being made right now.
Yeah, totally real. Our mission today is to explore this highly charged, like incredibly provocative interview from the YouTube channel JTV, the Global Jewish Channel.
And the guest sitting in the hot seat for this one is Andrew Gold. He's this British documentarian who has sort of morphed into a massive YouTube podcaster, specifically creating this wildly popular channel called Heretics.
Yeah, and before we dive into the deep end of this material, we need to make something explicitly clear to you, our listener.
Very clear.
Today's source material delves into highly sensitive, deeply politically charged topics. I mean, we are going to be unpacking discussions about immigration, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Islam, and British nationalism.
And that is a crucial disclaimer. Our goal here is absolutely not to endorse or, condemn any of the viewpoints we're going to discuss. We aren't picking sides here.
No, not at all. Whether these ideas align with a left-wing perspective, a right-wing perspective, or somewhere completely off the traditional map, our job is just to neutrally and impartially synthesize these arguments exactly as they're presented in the interview.
Exactly. We want to provide you with a clear topological map of this specific ideological landscape. So you can understand the terrain of modern discourse without us telling you where to build your house, basically.
I love that analogy. And the core theme we are really examining here is how shifting demographics and monumental geopolitical events can completely rewire not just a single media personality's career,
But an entire community's political allegiances. Right.
yeah, and their fundamental worldview. We are looking at the actual mechanics of ideological realignment.
So to understand these highly controversial viewpoints we're going to get into, we first need to understand the messenger.
Right, Andrew Gold himself.
Yeah, we have to look at how he was shaped by the traditional media landscape before he ever branded himself as a so-called heretic. Because his background is, frankly, fascinating.
It really is. According to the interview, Gold wasn't like a great student in the traditional sit at a desk and take notes kind of sense.
No, he had this intense, almost obsessive passion for languages.
Yeah. In his 20s, he actually went out and learned to speak 5 different languages fluently. He lived in France, Germany, Brazil, Argentina.
And his motivation wasn't just to be this, polyglot who could order coffee anywhere in Europe. It was highly specific. He wanted to infiltrate what he called weird worlds.
Which is such a cool phrase, weird worlds.
It is. He grew up watching famous documentary makers like Louis Theroux and John Ronson.
Oh, I love John Ronson.
Right. Those are creators who immerse themselves in fringe cultures, cults, and bizarre subcultures. Gold wanted to be the next one in that lineage.
And the linguistic angle is actually a brilliant piece of career engineering, if you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. Gold recognized that the documentary field is incredibly crowded. I mean, everyone with a camera wants to be Louis Theroux, so how do you get an edge?
His answer was language.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you can speak to people in their native tongue, you completely bypass that observer effect that happens when you use a translator.
Yeah, you gain a level of access, intimacy, and trust that an outsider simply cannot achieve. It's the difference between watching a documentary and being in the room.
And this linguistic skill allowed him to make short documentaries about incredibly niche fringe groups like UFO cults, the adult film industry.
And it eventually led to his major breakthrough, right?
Yeah, he made an award-winning documentary about an Argentine exorcist.
Wow.
But this wasn't just an observational piece. The exorcist actually became completely unstable during the filming and tried to kill Gold.
I literally tried to kill him.
Literally. It is the ultimate high-stakes narrative. It is exactly the kind of gripping, visceral storytelling that a major television network should, in theory, just salivate over.
Right. And yet, this is where the story takes a massive, career-altering pivot. because he spent years trying to sell this documentary.
He essentially begs the BBC to just sit down and watch it.
And they do, right. They take it, and suddenly he is having meetings with all these high-level BBC producers. They tell him they love his ideas. They want to run with the incredible, dangerous access he spent years cultivating.
But there's a massive catch, a completely paradigm-shifting catch for him.
What?
Well, according to Gold's account in the interview, the producers told him they desperately wanted to use his ideas, but they did not want him on screen.
Oh, wow.
His claim is that they told him explicitly that they were, quote, sick of white men, and that he needed to stay behind the camera as a producer, basically feeding his ideas to someone who fit a different demographic profile.
Man. And he refused, right?
Completely. He says he found it deeply offensive to his journalistic sensibilities and to the sheer amount of dangerous work he had actually put in.
It makes you think about traditional media gatekeeping, you know? I want you to imagine the traditional media ecosystem not as a ladder, but as this exclusive walled garden.
I like that.
The gatekeepers stand at the heavy iron doors, and they decide who gets to bring their seeds inside to plant. But when those gates close on someone, those seeds don't just magically disappear.
No, they blow over the wall.
Exactly. They blow over the wall and they start growing wildly out in the unregulated, chaotic terrain of YouTube. And that is exactly what Gold did.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, he started an independent podcast.
Yeah, interviewing cult defectors and fringe figures. But then, after the October 7th attacks in Israel, everything changed again.
What's fascinating here is that this is the critical juncture where we have to talk about the mechanics of digital media. Digital media does not operate with the same constraints or the same safety nets as traditional television.
Right.
Gold had built an audience of about 350,000 subscribers with his initial podcast, which was, somewhat mainstream adjacent. But after the October 7th attacks, he felt an urgent need to begin speaking more openly about British cultural issues.
Specifically about Islam and the demographic shifts in the UK.
Exactly. And he explicitly states in the interview that this was a massive problem for his existing audience. He realized the audience he had carefully built over years simply wouldn't accept this pivot.
So what does he do? Does he, temper his opinions? No. He just abandons ship entirely and starts a brand new one.
He started a brand new channel called Heretics. And we really need to pause and explain what is happening here beneath the surface, because it's a textbook example of a phenomenon called audience capture.
Okay, break that down for us, because it sounds like he just changed his branding, but you're saying there's a deeper psychological mechanism at play.
There is. In traditional media, a broadcaster speaks to an audience. But in digital media, the creator and the audience are in a constant algorithmic feedback loop.
Ah.
When you start talking about hyper-specific cultural anxieties, especially ones that are considered taboo in the mainstream, the algorithm identifies a deeply engaged, often highly polarized demographic that is desperate for that content.
And then it just pushes it to them.
Exactly. The algorithm rewards you with massive views, which triggers dopamine in the creator, encouraging them to lean further into those extremes. You don't just capture an audience. The audience captures you.
That is wild to think about. Gold abandoned a massive chunk of his 350,000 old subscribers. But by leaning into these highly controversial topics on the new channel, Heretics absolutely exploded.
It grew to 800,000 subscribers in just 2.5 years.
So if this community is feeling this intense demographic panic and the mainstream media is too afraid to touch it, where do they go? They are forced to look at the unregulated fringes.
And Gold is completely outside the walled garden now.
Yeah.
And he's built his own massive estate.
Which makes you wonder how the mainstream actually interacts with someone who has successfully branded themselves a heretic. Gold talks about the intense contrast between how the media operates in the UK versus the US. He argues that the UK suffers from a profound, paralyzing culture of fear.
It's a very sharp contrast he draws. He points out that in the United States, you will regularly see A-list household name celebrities.
Like Matthew McConaughey, he mentions.
Yeah, Matthew McConaughey is a great example. People like that are willing to go on long-form, heterodox platforms like the Joe Rogan Experience. They aren't terrified of the association. In fact, they see it as a way to reach a massive, unfiltered audience.
But in the UK, Gold claims the atmosphere is entirely different.
Right. He says that incredibly famous mainstream British celebrities privately message him to say they watch his show, they love his content, but they are absolutely terrified to appear on it.
Just because of the headaches it would cause for their careers. Let's visualize this. Think of the Overton window, the range of acceptable ideas in a society, not as a room, but as a spotlight shining on a massive pitch-black stage.
Okay, I could see that.
Whatever is inside that circle of light is acceptable to say in polite society. Gold is standing way out in the dark, and he's trying to drag these A-list celebrities out there into the darkness with him, hoping that if they come, the spotlight operator will be forced to widen the beam to keep the celebrities visible.
But the celebrities are petrified.
Right. Gold wants them to legitimize him, but the celebrities are terrified that the darkness will delegitimize them. Their brand partnerships, their public standing, their polite dinner party invitations, it's all on the line.
It is a massive game of reputational chicken. And because those A-listers won't step out of the spotlight, figures like Gold are left looking for mainstream validation from wherever they can get it, even from highly chaotic sources.
Which brings him to discuss Piers Morgan.
Right. Piers Morgan hosts Piers Morgan Uncensored, which is this massive combative platform that actually does invite heterodox thinkers.
Now, Gold is highly critical of Morgan in many ways. He accuses Morgan of moving with the wind and heavily sensationalizing deeply sensitive topics just for television ratings.
Yeah, he recounts this one specific experience of going on Morgan's show to discuss grooming gangs in the UK. Gold gets there, and he is placed on a panel with guests who immediately deflect the conversation by claiming that the grooming gangs were actually a fiction invented by Israel.
Which is a wildly anti-Semitic conspiracy theory suddenly injected into a conversation about domestic UK crime.
And Gold describes feeling subjected to this rabid anti-Semitism on live television, while Piers Morgan basically just sat back and watched the fireworks in the name of, free speech and high ratings.
Yeah, Gold calls the experience of being on Morgan's show fundamentally unenjoyable and chaotic.
But, and this is a massive structural buddy in the context of the interview,
Mm.
Gold still gives Piers Morgan credit.
Wait, really? Why?
Because amidst all that chaos and sensationalism, Gold says Morgan actually treats Jewish guests with basic, fundamental humanity.
Wow.
And Gold points to another example. Tom York, the frontman of the band Radiohead.
Okay, what did he do?
York put out a public statement that was incredibly damning of the Israeli government. He directly compared Benjamin Netanyahu to a dictator. But in that very same statement, York acknowledged the extreme religious ideology on the opposing side, and he essentially recognized Israelis as human beings who were dealing with a complex, terrifying situation.
And we really need to pause and look at the psychology of what Gold is saying here. Think about the psychological relief he is describing.
It's huge.
A celebrity heavily, viciously criticizes the government of Israel, but because that celebrity simply acknowledges the basic humanity of the people living there, Gold describes the reaction of the Jewish diaspora as one of immense, profound relief.
Which highlights just how agonizingly low the bar has gotten in our public discourse. When the discourse is so polarized that one side feels completely dehumanized, the simple, basic acknowledgement of nuance, just saying, these people are humans too, is viewed as a massive, sweeping victory by a group that feels targeted.
It is a stark, almost depressing realization. The bar for validation is literally just, please acknowledge we are human. And this perceived silence from the mainstream, this culture of fear that keeps the spotlight so narrow, is exactly what fuels Gold's central and honestly most explosive thesis about British society.
He does not hold back.
No, he refers to multiculturalism in the UK as a cult. And he says it's a cult that the British people, and he specifically emphasizes the Jewish community, fell for hook, line, and sinker.
This is where his arguments become deeply philosophical. He compares the concept of multiculturalism to communism.
That is a massive claim. We can't just breeze past that. Why communism? What is the architectural logic of that comparison?
The logic lies in the concept of utopian failure. Gold is arguing that communism failed because it was a beautiful idea on paper. The idea that everyone will share perfectly, that class struggles will dissolve into harmony.
Right, the utopian dream.
But it fundamentally failed in practice because it completely ignored human nature. It ignored human self-interest and ambition. Gold applies that exact same logic to multiculturalism.
Okay, I see where it's going.
He argues that multiculturalism is a lovely concept on a brochure. The idea that dozens of completely disparate cultures can live side by side with perfectly equal standing and zero friction. But he claims it fails because it ignores human tribalism and in-group preference.
It requires human beings to be something completely different from what they actually are by evolutionary nature.
Exactly. And he draws a very specific, sharp distinction here that we need to clarify. He says there is a fundamental difference between multiracialism and multiculturalism.
Yeah, he states very clearly that he fully supports a multiracial society. People of all different skin colors living together is not his issue. His issue is with the cultures.
He argues that multiculturalism, the idea that you can just have a patchwork quilt of completely separate, distinct cultures operating independently with their own parallel values within one geographic border, is a complete failure.
He believes a functional society requires integration into a single dominant cultural norm. He even uses a recent 3-week trip to Japan as his ideal model for how a society should function.
Yes, the Japan comparison is central to his thesis. He observes that Japan is incredibly clean, the society is profoundly polite, crime is low, and they are deeply protective of their social norms.
And he points out the mechanics of their society, right? You can't simply move to Japan, live there for 5 years, and declare yourself Japanese.
No, not at all. The society is highly resistant to assimilation by outsiders. They expect fierce, unwavering adherence to their cultural customs. Gold contrasts this rigid protection of cultural identity with the current trajectory of the United Kingdom.
Which he feels has completely abandoned its own cultural norms in a naive attempt to accommodate everyone else's.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because I have to jump in here and push back on this Japan analogy.
Right. You are taking an island nation with thousands of years of deep, intentional ethnic homogeneity and strict isolationist policies and trying to apply its rules to a post-imperial melting pot.
The United Kingdom is a historically global imperial hub.
Exactly. The UK spent centuries sailing around the world, colonizing and absorbing cultures from the Caribbean to India. Can a historically global empire realistically revert to the cultural rigidity of an isolated island nation? It seems like he's trying to put the toothpaste back into a very old tube.
And that right there is exactly the structural flaw you have to grapple with in his argument. He is looking at an ethnostate and trying to apply its rules to a fundamentally different historical entity.
Right.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture and dig into why he's making that comparison, we hit the classic sociological debate between integration and assimilation.
Let's define those because people use them interchangeably and they aren't the same thing at all.
Exactly. Integration means you can keep your private practices. Gold mentions Jewish people having their religious practices at home, or Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus having their specific practices in their private lives.
But in the public sphere, you adapt to and uphold the dominant culture. You speak the language, you follow the public norms.
Assimilation, on the other hand, means completely losing your original culture to adopt the new one. Gold is advocating for forceful integration into what he calls the English ethnos.
And he specifically addresses a fascinating historical paradox. Why did the Jewish community, which he is a part of, champion open borders and multiculturalism in the first place?
Right, he says they fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Why?
Because historically, the Jewish diaspora lacked a nation of their own. For centuries, they were a minority living in other people's countries.
This created a natural, deeply ingrained historical aversion to strong nationalism. Whenever a European country became fiercely nationalist, it historically meant immense danger, persecution, or expulsion for the Jews living there.
So, as a defense mechanism, the community naturally championed open borders, pluralism, and multiculturalism. If everyone is a minority, then no one is the target.
But Gold is arguing that this historical embrace was fundamentally naive and has now resulted in a profound existential vulnerability.
And he backs up this claim of vulnerability with some very chilling demographic math. Gold's critique isn't just an abstract philosophical disagreement about whether multiculturalism is like communism.
No, the source material ties it directly to the physical, day-to-day safety of the Jewish diaspora in the UK right now.
To make his point, he pulls out data from Pew Research, claiming that 99% of people in Pakistan have unfavorable views of Jews.
He then takes that specific statistic and places it directly next to the United Kingdom's recent immigration numbers. He notes that in a single recent year, 1.3 million immigrants entered the UK, with a significant portion coming from countries like Pakistan, where those unfavorable views are allegedly systemic.
The math he presents to the listener is meant to be stark and terrifying. He points out that the UK is importing more people annually from countries with deeply ingrained anti-Semitic views than the entire historic Jewish population of the UK, which sits at roughly 200,000 to 300,000 people.
I want you, the listener, to really put yourself inside that demographic math for a second. If you were part of a distinct minority group of 300,000 people and 1 million people from regions that historically harbored deep institutional hostility toward your group moved into your neighborhood every single year.
How would your politics change? How would your worldview shift? Because Gold is saying this isn't hypothetical. This is exactly what is happening to his community.
And this ties into a deeper historical narrative that the interview explores. They reference a documentary produced by JTV called The Great Reversal.
Right. What's the premise?
This documentary argues that the global media narrative constantly and falsely frames every Israeli defensive action as an initial provocation.
Meaning the media always starts the clock when Israel fires back, making them look like the aggressor.
Precisely. But the Great Reversal documentary's thesis is that this narrative deliberately ignores centuries of Arab and Islamic anti-Semitism that completely predates the existence of the modern state of Israel.
It isn't just about the 1948 borders.
No, the documentary specifically cites violent attacks against Jews in the city of Safed in 1834. That is well over a century before Israel was even established.
The argument being made is that the current conflict is often presented by Western media in a historical vacuum, ignoring a long, documented, deeply rooted history of hostility.
And Gold argues that this specific ancient hostility is what is currently being imported into the West via mass immigration.
And this demographic anxiety, this fear of imported hostility, leads Gold to a really blunt, unvarnished conclusion about the Jewish diaspora's relationship with the state of Israel.
He quotes that famous scene with Jack Nicholson from the movie A Few Good Men.
Oh, Colonel Jessup, you can't handle the truth.
Exactly. The character talks about being the guy who has to stay on the wall with a gun and do the ugly things to keep everyone safe while they sleep under the blanket of the freedom he provides.
Gold uses this intense cinematic metaphor to argue that diaspora Jews living comfortably in London or New York, even if they fiercely disagree with specific actions or policies of the Israeli government, need to show some baseline gratitude.
He argues that Israel is the ultimate insurance policy keeping a roof over their heads, and that criticizing it relentlessly from the safety and comfort of the West is fundamentally ungrateful.
What's fascinating here is that this represents a total collapse of what sociologists call the progressive hierarchy of victimhood.
Can you break that down?
Sure. In modern progressive circles, there has traditionally been an intersectional hierarchy of marginalized groups. Intersectionality is the idea that different forms of discrimination like racism, sexism, classism intersect and overlap.
But Gold is referencing the comedian and writer David Baddiel, right?
Yes, who wrote a seminal book called Jews Don't Count. Baddiel's thesis is that anti-Semitism is the one form of racism that progressives routinely ignore, excuse, or even justify.
Because they view Jews as white, privileged, and therefore incapable of being true victims in the intersectional framework.
Exactly. What we are seeing in Gold's arguments is the psychological fallout of that exclusion. Sheer demographic fear is pushing historically liberal, progressive Jewish voters to drastically rethink their political alliances.
They feel completely abandoned by the left, which forces them to look elsewhere for security.
So if the mainstream left has abandoned them, and the mainstream media is too scared to touch the topic, where do they go? This brings us to the fracturing of the political landscape on the right.
Driven by these intense demographic fears, Gold outlines how the right wing in the UK is splintering, and it is presenting a massive, almost impossible dilemma for his community.
You have the traditional Conservative Party, the Tories, who have historically held the centre-right. Then you have Reform UK, a populist right party led by figures like Nigel Farage. Gold also mentions Kemi Badenoch favorably in this sphere.
But then, further out on the fringe, there's a newer, harder right faction called Restore, represented by figures like Rupert Lowe.
Gold's immediate pragmatic concern here is vote splitting. He is looking at the political chessboard and worrying that Restore will siphon off the hardest right-wing votes from Reform.
If the right is fractured and arguing amongst itself over who is the most authentically nationalist, he fears this will pave the way for what he terms an Islamo-Labor-Green alliance to sweep into power.
In Gold's worldview, which is entirely based on the demographic anxieties we just discussed, this left-wing alliance taking power is the absolute worst-case scenario. It represents an existential threat to the Jewish community in the UK.
But aligning with these further right factions to stop that from happening is incredibly thorny. These aren't natural allies for a historically liberal diaspora.
The hosts in the interview bring up a specific, highly revealing interaction on social media to highlight this tension. A comedian and commentator named Josh Howie directed a very pointed tweet at Rupert Lowe, the figurehead of that hard-right Restore party.
Howie didn't ask about tax policy or Brexit. He basically asked Lowe flatly in public, "Do you think Jews run the world?"
Wow. Just right out with it.
It was a very deliberate trap, a public litmus test. How he was trying to force Lowe to go on the record to see if he was pandering to a fringe anti-Semitic base within his own nationalist party.
The logic of the trap is simple. If Lowe unequivocally says, no, that's a ridiculous conspiracy theory, he risks angering a dark corner of his supporters who actually harbor those views.
But if he equivocates, if he dances around the question, he exposes a tolerance for anti-Semitism at the top of the party.
And Gold's reaction to this whole exchange is remarkably cynical, or perhaps just brutally, terrifyingly pragmatic. He admits he isn't entirely sure if Rupert Lowe harbors anti-Semitic views in his heart of hearts. He doesn't know for sure.
But he notes that the fundamental ethos of Restore's base is Britain first, not Israel first. They are fiercely isolationist and nationalist.
They aren't going to be the champions of the Jewish diaspora, but they might be the only ones willing to stop the immigration that Gold fears. And this leads Gold to suggest what is, frankly, an incredible compromise.
This is the part that is just staggering.
Right.
Gold himself is a vegetarian, but he notes that some of these right-wing nationalist parties have proposed banning kosher and halal animal slaughter.
Framing it as an animal rights issue, but effectively using it as a cultural wedge. Usually, a minority group would fiercely, aggressively fight to protect their ancient religious practices from state overreach.
But this is where the survival mechanics kick in. Gold suggests that if a ban on both kosher and halal slaughter was the political mechanism used to drastically dissuade further Islamic immigration into the UK, British Jews might just have to accept the loss of kosher meat as a necessary defensive strategy.
Let's just pause on that. He is saying, ban our sacred practices if it means you also ban theirs and keep them out.
It is the ultimate strategy of political triage. When a community feels their very physical existence is threatened by shifting demographics, they abandon their idealism. They abandon their comfort.
They abandon even core ancient cultural practices for sheer survival mechanics. It is cutting off an arm to save the body.
But I have to ask you, the listener, and I have to challenge this logic. Is the enemy of my enemy really my friend? Or are they just my next enemy waiting their turn?
Gold is suggesting abandoning a core cultural practice to build a legislative wall against another demographic group. Think about the day after that wall is built. Once it's built, who is in power?
The very nationalist people who just happily banned your cultural practice.
Exactly. You've just given state power to people who are perfectly willing to erase your traditions. It is an incredibly precarious, deeply defensive posture that assumes the crocodile will eat you last.
And that perfectly highlights the intense, overwhelming pessimism in Gold's worldview. He paints a picture of a Jewish community that feels entirely, hopelessly trapped.
They look to their left and they see an Islamo-left alliance that they feel actively despises them and excludes them from victimhood.
They look to their right and they see a far right that has historically persecuted them but might currently share an immediate common enemy.
It is a state of profound political desperation. They are choosing between the fire and the frying pan.
In this desperate search for strong, pragmatic, immediate allies, anyone who will stand on the wall and fight, leads Gold to what is undoubtedly the most controversial endorsement of the entire interview.
He argues that the ultimate solution for the Jewish community, and he interestingly includes Hindus and Sikhs in this bracket as well, framing it as a broader alliance against radical Islam, is to ally themselves with a highly polarizing, highly controversial figure named Tommy Robinson.
To truly understand the weight and the shock value of this endorsement, you have to know who Tommy Robinson is in the British context.
Right.
He's viewed by the mainstream media and the entire political establishment in the UK as an absolute pariah. He's the founder of the English Defence League. He has a massive, well-documented criminal record. He has been involved in street movements that have frequently turned violent, and his public relations image is essentially toxic to polite society.
If you are a mainstream politician or media figure, associating with Tommy Robinson is career suicide.
And Gold completely acknowledges this. He doesn't try to whitewash him. He admits Robinson has terrible PR, a criminal background, and what he describes as a chaotic, ADHD-driven personality that constantly causes legal and social trouble.
But despite all of that baggage, Gold praises Robinson's sheer, raw intelligence and his unique, undeniable ability to mobilize people.
Gold points out his own situation as a contrast. He has 800,000 YouTube subscribers, he has a massive digital footprint, but he freely admits he probably couldn't organize a physical rally in London of more than a few hundred people.
Tommy Robinson, on the other hand, can mobilize tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of working-class people to take to the streets at a moment's notice.
Gold argues that the Jewish community is far too prim and proper. They are too middle class, too polite, too reliant on writing sternly worded letters to members of parliament.
He says they desperately need a maverick, someone who is actively willing to get arrested, someone who is already so hated by the mainstream that they have nothing left to lose, to serve as their street-level defender.
This is where Gold employs the concept of the heretic to its absolute fullest, most radical extent. He doesn't just call Robinson an ally. He compares Tommy Robinson to Galileo.
So, what does this all mean? Comparing a modern street agitator with a criminal record to one of the most important astronomers and scientific minds in human history. What is the philosophical bridge he is trying to build there?
Gold is making a deeply philosophical, almost anarchic argument about the nature of societal norms and the law itself. He argues that laws are fundamentally subjective.
They aren't handed down from on high.
Right. They are merely downstream of whatever the current dominant culture dictates. To prove his point, he cites historical atrocities that were perfectly legal, heavily enforced, and socially acceptable in their time.
He points out that the institution of slavery was entirely legal.
He points out the laws in Nazi Germany that made it explicitly illegal to harbor or protect Jewish people.
His point being that just because something is the law or the accepted social norm doesn't mean it is morally correct. And when a society's laws and norms become fundamentally corrupted, or in his view, self-destructive, polite disagreement from the middle class isn't enough to change them.
Exactly. He argues that it requires heavily disagreeable, profoundly flawed, chaotic people to break bad societal norms. A polite middle-class intellectual is not going to break a corrupted law because they have way too much to lose.
They care about their mortgage, their reputation, their dinner party invitations.
Gold observes that middle-class, privately educated citizens expect resistance to take the form of polite essays in broadsheet newspapers and structured debates at universities.
But the actual physical, structural pushback against a society always comes from working-class environments where the behavioral norms are entirely different.
He argues that to break a paradigm, to shatter a broken system, you need someone who fundamentally does not care about being invited to the polite dinner parties. You need a sledgehammer, not a scalpel.
But I want to challenge this Galileo comparison, and I want the listener to really weigh this. When does breaking the rules make you a visionary who sees a truth society is blind to? And when does it just make you a criminal causing chaos for the sake of chaos?
That's the real question.
Galileo was persecuted for proving that the Earth revolved around the sun, an objective, mathematical, scientific reality. He was exposing a physical truth about the universe. Are the chaotic street politics and ethnic tensions of today really comparable to discovering the mechanics of the solar system?
Or is this massive historical comparison just a grand justification for embracing a street brawler because the polite democratic avenues feel closed off? It's a dangerous, incredibly slippery tightrope to walk.
It is entirely precarious. It borders on nihilism.
This raises an important question, though. What it truly underscores is the total catastrophic loss of faith in traditional institutions that Gold is articulating on behalf of his community.
When the media gatekeepers shut you out because you don't fit their demographic ideal, when the mainstream politicians seem paralyzed by a culture of fear, when the left excludes you from their umbrella of protection, and when demographic realities make you genuinely fear for your physical safety.
The appeal of the chaotic strongman, the heretic who promises protection regardless of the rules, becomes incredibly potent. It is a masterclass study in how radicalization, or at least radical political realignment, is born directly out of institutional distrust.
We have covered a massive amount of incredibly dense, challenging ground today. Let's summarize this intense journey.
It's been a lot.
We started by looking at how traditional media gatekeeping, specifically being told you can't be on screen because of your demographics, pushed a talented creator out of the walled garden and into the wild, algorithmically driven space of independent digital media, where audience capture fueled a pivot to the fringes.
We explored the deeply philosophical framing of multiculturalism, not as a beautiful tapestry, but as a failed utopian cult that demands humans act against their tribal nature.
We unpacked the profound demographic fears that are completely reshaping British politics, driving historically progressive minority groups to consider unimaginable, desperate compromises, like legally banning their own religious practices just to build a defensive legislative wall.
And finally, we looked at the desperate, Highly controversial alliances being formed in response to all of this institutional failure, culminating in the embrace of figures deemed entirely toxic and unacceptable by mainstream society, simply because they are the only ones willing to fight the physical battles that polite society ignores.
It is a stark, complicated, and entirely unvarnished look at a specific ideological shift happening right now. And it forces us to look at the mechanics of our own political beliefs.
And so I want to leave you with a final concept to mull over, something that builds on everything we've wrestled with today. If Gold's underlying thesis is right, that society fundamentally relies on heretics and disagreeable, flawed people to point out its catastrophic blind spots, how do we accurately distinguish between a true heretic who is trying to save a culture and a simple arsonist who just wants to watch it burn down?
That's such a tough line to draw.
In your own life and in your own media diet, who are the heretics you absolutely refuse to listen to? And what if they are seeing a critical blind spot that you are currently missing?
A massive, uncomfortable question to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this complex deep dive into the source material. Until next time, keep questioning the landscape.